Okay. Hi guys. I think we are ready to try another Stitch With Me video. Now, I am aware that this will probably not all be in focus. I may have to work on the alignment of the picture, but at least you will see the picture, maybe not all of my stitching, but hey. Anyway, welcome. This is my second coffee time Stitch With Me, and this is the first time that I am actually going to try and discuss, not necessarily in depth, but probably at length, one of the topics that has been in the political debates in the Netherlands in the past year. I was just threading my needle there. This is Coffee Saves Lives. This is a pattern in the Magical Elixir series by, gosh, what's her name? Beth, I think? No? Heartstring Samplery. I will link, excuse me, I will try and include a link and description of the pattern. Before we get into our topic, I just want to explain some of the basics for these Stitch With Me videos that I'm planning to make. What I'm trying to do is explain a bit more about the rules and regulations and political debates that are going on in my country, the Netherlands. Generally, our political views are considered to be very liberal and progressive, and from that point of view I thought it would be interesting to share and to hear from you what you think about these topics and how they are regulated in your country. What I'm talking about will not necessarily reflect my personal view, and I'm also not out to lecture or force opinions on other people about how I believe things should be. I'm just trying to share how things are in my country, what I'm used to, and I've tried my best to give an accurate representation of that, but I'm not sure. I might miss out some details or specifics. I am not a doctor or a politician or a lawmaker or whatever. So and I have to translate some Dutch jargon to English, so the words that I'm using might not always be the most accurate ones, but it's the best I could do with Google Translate. Finally, to make this introduction, try and keep this introduction brief. It's not an in-depth lecture. It's just meant to be a general introduction with some personal experiences maybe here and there, and some emphasis on the current debates that are going on regarding the topics that I'm discussing. And I am just curious to hear how these topics are regulated in your neck of the woods. So without further ado, if this is not your thing, thanks for stopping by. Please move on and find something you do enjoy, because you would be wasting my time and yours if you would watch a video that you just don't like. I'm going to talk today about a topic that has been in our news lately, which is active euthanasia, also referred to as assisted suicide. This might be a topic that is hard for you to listen to. I can totally understand that. It might be a personal thing, it might be a belief thing, it might be personal circumstances. Feel free to skip this video if this is not your topic. Before we talk about the regulations in our country, I thought I might try and start stitching and maybe get a start on this pattern. I am totally not sure if I can manage this without I'm trying to keep my hand away from the screen. What I usually do when I start stitching, just a side note here, is I use a pin stitch. It doesn't matter if I start with 2 threads or 1. I will generally try to start with a pin stitch. Nowadays I used to start with a loop stitch from the front, but I prefer the pin stitch now. That doesn't mean I am 100% committed to it, because that's just not the kind of person that I am. But yeah, so the current thread I'm using is by xJudesigns on Etsy. This is a conversion of the original thread that was called for. I don't think I had it in my stash, so that's why I replaced it. This is called Wickered Basket. I'm not sure if it's in her regular line, but you can always ask. It is a nicely variegated beige to a orange rusty brown kind of color, and I do like it. Now let's see if I can actually stitch, and already have a knot in the back, I think. Let's see, yeah, I thought so. That is more related to how I'm holding my hands at the moment, I think, because it's not how I'm used to stitching. But yeah, let's see if I can look at my notes while I stitch and have a coherent discussion. So, before we go into the rules and regulations, it might be useful to establish a definition of what active euthanasia means. What I found is that there are several ways in which a patient can try and shorten their suffering, and that could be by refusing treatment. That could be if their doctor has no other effective medication or treatment for them, and they decide to stop treatment. And the doctor can also help by increasing the doses of painkillers slowly to alleviate suffering and resulting in a quicker passing of the patient. Now, all those examples are not examples of active euthanasia. Active euthanasia is, in the debate I'm having today, is when the doctor applies a substance that has the intention of ending the life of the patient within a short time at a specific request of the patient. And assisted suicide is a variation on that definition, and it's basically the same, only the patient will apply the substance themselves under supervision of their doctor. So the doctor doesn't do the actual deed, but the patient does it himself or herself. Yeah, okay, I need to see if I can. I'm working on the border, but I'm finding out that might be tricky because I actually have to I don't really want to travel my thread too much in the back, so I need to sometimes have a few stitches in the back while you stare at my legs, probably. To keep the back a bit neater. So, having established the definition of active euthanasia, what is the current legislation in the Netherlands? Let me start by saying it is illegal in the Netherlands to assist anybody in suicide. But since 2002 we have actually legislation that makes it legal to do so for specific persons, i.e. medical doctors, under very specific conditions. So that is our euthanasia legislation. It is illegal except if you're a doctor and except if there are all the conditions that are stated in the law have been met. And what are these conditions? There are a number, and I'm keeping to the main ones that are usually talked about. It can only be on the request of the patient. And when the patient makes a request, they have to be mentally competent, or they have had to have made a written declaration when they were still mentally competent before they became ill. The doctor needs to be certain that the situation of the patient is hopeless and that there is a condition of unbearable suffering and there is no other remedy or solution to end the suffering in another way, like with medication or treatment. The doctor has to educate the patient about the procedures, and they also have to consult with at least one other doctor to decide if all the conditions for euthanasia are met and that there is no alternative. The doctor has to apply the correct substances. They are prescribed substances to commit active euthanasia, and they have to be present at the death, and they have to report the death immediately to the local authorities, and they have to make a report that it is indeed an active euthanasia case, so that the coroner can perform an autopsy. I'm already going wrong. So, Stitch With Me videos means that you will probably make a lot of progress in stitching, and I probably won't. Because everything that can go wrong is going wrong, because now I've knotted my thread to my needle, or not? No. Okay, there was already a knot in the thread. So, these conditions are very important because they are the basis on which decide if a patient is eligible for euthanasia. You may wonder how many people actually make use of this option. So I have an estimate from like a doctors organization that's in the Netherlands. There's about 47,000 requests for active euthanasia every year. Most people who request euthanasia suffer from incurable cancer and want to speed up the last leg of their cancer. It's about 80% of the cases that have incurable cancer that request euthanasia. I have figures from 2015 when there were about 5,500 people who passed away by form of euthanasia or assisted suicide, and for that year that was about 4% of all deaths. So when you look at the amount of requests for euthanasia, which I mentioned, which was 47,000, we're talking about maybe 10 to 12% of the applications that are actually granted and lead to active euthanasia. So that's not a lot. There's not a lot of granted requests, and there's not a lot of actual deaths compared to the total number of deaths. Well, in my opinion, it's not a lot. When you look worldwide, because there are other countries where active euthanasia or assisted suicide is legal, and we're talking about between 0.3 to 5% of all deaths reported are deaths by euthanasia or assisted suicides in places where it's legal. So we are in that bracket. There are more and more places where it is being legalized, but still there's only a few countries in the world. I will come back to that later. So how many people in the Netherlands actually support this policy? There is an estimate of about 75% of the population that agrees with having the option for active euthanasia. The part that doesn't agree is either doesn't know what to think of it or has personal or religious objections, which I can understand. So, why are so little requests for euthanasia being granted? Well, that is actually to do, let's try and check if how I'm doing. Okay, this might be better for you. It has to do with the conditions that are pretty strict. As I mentioned, one of the conditions is that you can only request euthanasia as a patient, which implies that you have to have an illness, so you have to have a physical or mental illness, and usually it's only granted for physical illness. It's hard to get a grant for euthanasia for mental illness, and that is because of the other condition that you have to be mentally competent as a patient when you make the request. So, for example, if you are suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's and you don't want to continue with your life, it is very hard to be granted euthanasia if you didn't make a written statement about what conditions you don't want to prolong your life before you got sick, because you are not considered to be mentally competent. So that is why it's hard sometimes to get euthanasia requests granted. Other reasons are that it's hard to decide, because the doctor has to decide that it is indeed an unbearable condition, that there's no prospect for any cure or improvement of life, and that means that it's hard sometimes to decide when enough is enough. And that has also to do with other conditions, and that I will come back to as well, regarding what would be considered unbearable suffering. It might not necessarily be an illness. It might be loneliness or just being done and ready to move on. Then another condition is that the patient has to find a doctor who is willing to commit euthanasia. And if their own doctor is not willing to do it, then they will have no obligation to refer the patient to a different doctor, which means that the patient will have to find a doctor for themselves, which might be hard. But to compensate for that, there are end-of-life clinics that you can turn to in those cases. More complications are for underaged patients. After 2002, there has been an addition to the law for euthanasia of underage children. Children between the age of 12 and 16 are allowed to request euthanasia if they have permission to do so from their parents or their guardians. Children between the age of 16 and 17 can request euthanasia without their guardian's permissions, but the guardian or parent needs to be involved in the process. So it needs to have been consulted. I might come back to that later. So those are examples of why it might be difficult to actually get your request for euthanasia granted. Now I think it's time to share a little bit about my own personal experiences. I think it's always important to have a bit more perspective from someone with experience, because it might help in understanding what is involved. What I'm trying to talk about is without revealing too much personal information about the persons involved. So that's why I'm mainly looking for words and trying to be careful what I say. Like most people, I have lost people who have passed away throughout my life. Young people, old people, sick people, healthy people, as a result of illness, accidents, suicide, euthanasia. In my experience, especially in cases where people have been ill for quite a while and they are in pain, they don't see a way out, I can really understand that they would choose, if they have the option to commit euthanasia. And I'm trying to see if I made an error here. I must have. Oh yeah, I made an error. Let's frog, ladies and gentlemen. Let's frog while I talk. So yeah. I have not come across that. Well, there was one case where I had a hard time with the person choosing the path of euthanasia. This involved a minor. It was someone I knew through the gaming community, online gaming that I did for quite a while. It was a young person, not gonna say anything more than that, but they suffered from very bad depression, and they were done. Let's put it like that. They wanted out. And I remember them sharing their experience in the process of applying for euthanasia, how difficult it was because they were young, and because of the fact that it was a mental illness which could kind of be controlled with medication, but that would dull their life and their mind so much that they considered it to be such a degradation of their quality of life that they would rather opt out. And I have had many discussions with this person about, are you sure? There is so much more to offer. This might just be a dark period. Why not wait? And I have never seen them and heard them be more happy. I'm sorry. This is hard. I've never seen them more happy than the day they got their approval for euthanasia. And it's hard to understand. But I think if they hadn't had approval, they might have committed suicide. And I don't think that is a better alternative. So yeah. It's a very strange thing to have to come to terms with, and no one can decide easily for someone else if their life is done, if they are suffering unbearably or not. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's not, but the fact that they have a choice is very important to me. Okay, I think we're back on track. Almost. I'm sorry, I have to blow my nose. Other circumstances where I've had loved ones pass away from euthanasia. Oh, excuse me. Okay, moving on. My battery was almost done, so I had to make sure that I didn't lose my notes. But yeah, other times when I've had to deal with euthanasia, the thing that struck me most is that there is a sense of relief that the suffering is almost done, not only for the patient but for their close relatives and friends as well. And the weirdest thing ever is the opportunity to consciously say goodbye to someone. In most other situations where I've had loved ones pass away, there was no opportunity to say goodbye because they passed suddenly or because they were simply not conscious at the time. So yeah, that's another aspect of it that is hard and also rewarding at the same time, that you are actually able to consciously say goodbye to your loved one. So yeah, that's a bit of my personal experiences. I'm not adding those for sympathy or whatever, just for a personal touch, I guess. Yeah. I'm trying to see. Yeah, this is the right hole, I think. Yes. Yeah. What else did I want to mention about this? Yeah, so the reason that I wanted to talk about this subject in particular was that there have been in the last few months 2 occasions where there was political or legal debate about this legislation. And one of them is a court case that has been going on for 5 years now, in several stages. This involves a man who assisted his mother actively in her suicide. His mother was 99. This was back in 2008. And he noticed that she was hoarding pills to try and commit suicide because she was done. And it was difficult for her to be eligible for euthanasia. She had a lot of physical problems, but not enough to justify the condition of unbearable suffering in the opinion of the medical world. In her opinion, she was ready. So he decided he would help her because he noticed that she was hoarding pills that would not be effective. And they together discussed and consciously planned for her passing. He decided to film this whole process, not just the passing, but the whole process of the discussions about what she wanted, why it was impossible to get it the legal way, why he was helping, etc. And this was turned into a documentary, and he was trying also to use this as an example case of why his belief of expanding the laws, the possibilities for euthanasia. Okay, now I was almost done, and then I realized that it wasn't recording anymore, so I had to check back and see where I was and move on from there. So sorry about that, and might be a bit incoherent, but yeah. So I was talking about court case, or the person who had assisted his mother with active suicide. His alternative motive for helping his mother was not alone to end her suffering, but also because he was a believer in, or he is a believer in, extending the conditions for active euthanasia to include more than just unbearable suffering, because he believes that the definition for that is too narrow. So that's why he made that documentary, also to help stir up a political debate, which worked. This ended up as a court case. He was his case was presented in court first time in 2015, if I remember correctly. Yes, so I need to go back a bit and try and recap the story. And count at the same time. So yeah, sorry for all the ums. I'm kind of out of, yeah. So in 2015 his case was presented in court. In 2013 his case was presented in court. The public prosecutor, no, that's not relevant. There was the court decision in which the court decided that he was in fact guilty, because assisted suicide is not legal, as I explained at the start of this video. If you are not a doctor, you are not allowed to assist in suicide. But the court also decided that they would not impose a punishment, even though he was guilty. So then the public prosecutor went to court again, because they were not satisfied with this judgment. And in 2015 a different court decided that actually the defendant was not guilty at all, and that his assisted suicide was not illegal, and that he was exempt from further punishment, or prosecution, sorry. Now, that is a bit odd. That are two totally different judgments, rulings. So the public prosecution decided to appeal in cassation, and in 2016 they were advised by the Attorney General of the High Council to reject the appeal because of force majeure. So that was the third attempt. But the High Council did refer the case back to the courts. So another court case followed, and in 2017 the public prosecutor argued that even though the motive for the defendant was justifiable, it was still illegal to assist in suicide, because that is just simply the law. And they demanded 3 months provisional jail sentence as a punishment. Now, in January of this year, the court came with their decision, their ruling, and they ruled as follows. The defendant was given a guilty verdict, so he first was guilty, then he was not guilty, then it was force majeure, and now he's guilty again. And they gave a punishment of 6 months provisional jail sentence. So they, in contrary to other courts, they gave him a punishment while other courts did not, and they gave him a higher punishment than what the public prosecutor has asked for. So yeah, even our legal system is confused about what to do with this case. But it has helped, excuse me, I'm getting an itchy throat. It has helped in the public debate about what is considered to be unbearable suffering. When is it right to grant assisted suicide or euthanasia? So that brings me to another political debate, because there is one political party who is fervently pushing, or was fervently pushing, for an extension of the conditions for euthanasia. And their argument was mainly that people that consider their lives to be fulfilled, they have no more outlook on life, that anything they want to achieve, and they just want to move on. For them, it's almost impossible to get assisted suicide or euthanasia, even though they really want to die. So this political party had this high on their agenda at the last elections as something they wanted to achieve. Now, the problem with the last elections was that there was a lot of votes for a lot of different parties. And I mentioned before that we have a system where there is always a coalition of parties that is in government and that gets the majority of the votes, because one party never gets the majority of the votes because there are too many parties. And for this election that was not much different, but in this case they needed to get the majority, they needed 4 parties. And they needed the party that I mentioned that wanted to push for a wider euthanasia legislation. And they also needed another party that is has a very Christian background and is definitely not at all in favor of euthanasia or even extending the legislation for that. So that was a problem. So after a lot of debate, the party decided to have an initiative legislation to see if there was enough of a backing from the political parties to try and amend the legislation. And the compromise they made, that they said they still wanted to expand the conditions for people who did not suffer from physical or mental illness, but that the condition would be that they had to be 75 years or older to be eligible for euthanasia if they felt their life was complete. Now, this is something that about 65% of the population agree with, that these people should have options. However, the party would have liked to have a more broader range and not just an age limit, because of examples that I mentioned before about minors even considering their life to be finished and not having to want to wait until they're 75. But yeah, this revised version has been in Parliament and did not make it, because the political parties are just too divided on the subject. So that was pushed aside until at the end of this end of last year, the person who was striving hardest to get this legislation through, I'm sorry, I'm not at all stitching, mentioned that even though Parliament did not come to a compromise or an agreement, she would still like to try and push again for an expansion of the legislation. So that was the second reason why I thought this was an interesting topic to discuss in this coffee time stitch with me. Yeah, not a lot of stitching going on, but yeah, anyway. So there's one more thing I had mentioned, and I'm checking to see if I'm still recording. Yes. So as I mentioned in the start of the video, the Netherlands is not the only country with legislation for euthanasia. They were the first, but closely followed by Belgium, which is our southern neighbor, who adopted euthanasia legislation in the same year, only a few months after us. And there are some other countries where euthanasia is legal, and those are, as far as I'm aware, as far as I could find, Luxembourg, which is another country close to us, Colombia, Canada, and India, which was a bit of a surprise for me. It's not a country that I immediately would have thought of, but you know, I can sort of understand. And then there are countries where assisted suicide is legal, so that is the case where the patient applies the lethal dose and not the doctor. And those are again a few European countries, including Switzerland and Germany, as well as Japan. And there are some states in the United States that allow for this. And I have to give special mention to Oregon, because they already had legalized assisted suicide in 1994, which is pretty liberal, pretty progressive, I must say. So yeah, that's about all I wanted to mention about this topic. I would love to hear from you if you found this interesting at all, if you missed anything in what I talked about, specific topics or whatever. If you want to express your views on whether or not you agree with the legislation, that is fine. As long as you keep it civilized, I would say. I'm always open for debate. Although that's not my intention for this video, as I said before. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what you thought of this, and if you think it's a good idea to do this again for other topics. Yeah, I know this is about 40 minutes, something like that, so good time to also sign off. I'm going to check what a mess I've made of this and probably have to frog again. I hope you don't, and I hope you got some stitching done. And I will see you again for a regular update, or maybe even another coffee time edition. Thanks for watching. Bye guys. Hi guys. I forgot to add one thing that I thought was important to mention. I will add some links to general information pages about this subject in the description box, and I will also include some numbers for if you are struggling. I will try and look up some places where you could get help. Yeah, you never know. So that's all I wanted to add. Bye guys.